The Dark Scrolls. Under the dim light of 1,000 candles, the Tudor world begins to breathe again. The stone walls of Hampton Court hold the murmurs of laughter and betrayal, the perfume of roses mingled with the scent of wax and iron. England stands in the 16th century, an island trembling between God and crown, between order and desire. The age is restless. The throne, newly secure after generations of civil war, now turns its face toward splendor and danger alike. And within the splendor, within the mirrored chambers and jeweled halls, beats the most forbidden rhythm of all, the human heart. The Tudors had rebuilt England from the ashes of the Wars of the Roses. Henry VII's union with Elizabeth of York had healed the wound of blood, uniting the red and white roses into the Tudor emblem that would soon blossom across the realm. But what peace could not erase was fear. Fear of betrayal, fear of weakness, fear of the passions that once brought down kings. In this new age, the court became a theater where obedience was survival and silence was the highest form of wisdom. The eyes of monarchs were everywhere, and yet, even under the watch of God and crown, love found its hidden corners. It is said that Henry VIII's court was the grandest in Europe. Gold-threaded tapestries, musicians from Venice, ambassadors from Spain, poets who turned lies into art. But beneath the surface of ceremony lay a world of glances and secrets. The king himself was still young then, broad-shouldered and radiant, his temper not yet corrupted by time. He was England's golden youth, and the kingdom danced around him like a flame. Yet even in his triumph, he did not know that the heart he sought to control in others would one day betray him most. The Tudor court was a cage gilded with jewels. Every noble family sought favor, every daughter a place near the queen, every son a post near the king's side. Alliances were made not by affection, but by bloodline and strategy. The queen's ladies-in-waiting, silent, painted in silks, were the invisible bridges between power and ruin. A single whisper could unmake a household. A touch of the king's gaze could transform a life. Behind the solemn portraits that survive, those serene, expressionless faces framed by velvet and pearls, there were rivalries, fear, and the quiet defiance of those who dared to love in secret. The laws of the time were written to preserve dynasties, not hearts. Marriage was duty, affection, and indulgence. Love was a language spoken only in confession or sin. Yet even the mightiest kings could not legislate the pulse that stirred beneath the crown. In this contradiction, between holiness and hunger, between loyalty and longing, the Tudor dynasty found both its vitality and its curse. The chronicles speak in careful tones, their ink dry with restraint. They tell of treaties, of wars, of alliances signed and broken. But between their lines lies another record, one that never made it into the ledgers of kings. The secret lives of the heart, the letters hidden in prayer books, the tokens sewn into gowns, the eyes that met across the cathedral during Mass. These too are documents of power, though written in the invisible script of longing. The world around the Tudors was changing. The Renaissance had begun to whisper of beauty and human desire as things divine. Painters now dared to portray not saints, but faces touched by emotion. Music carried not only hymns, but yearning. The old certainties of heaven and hell began to shift, and so too did the boundaries of sin. In this fragile dawn of humanism, England's court became both stage and altar for the most dangerous act of all, love without permission. Henry VIII's youth was defined by triumph. He married Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Spain, sister of queens. The union was meant to solidify alliances, to display the power of the new dynasty. Yet behind their public devotion, small fractures began to form. Catherine was older, devout, her heart anchored in duty. Henry, restless, drawn to the thrill of conquest, not only on the battlefield, but in the eyes of women. The court learned quickly that affection could be fatal. Every noblewoman who entered the royal household knew the rules. Obedience first, silence second. Yet desire, like a hidden current, ran beneath the floors of Whitehall and Hampton Court. There were glances across banquets, letters carried by servants through narrow passages, trysts whispered into the cold air of gallery corridors. Some sought power through love, others found only ruin. The Tudors lived in a paradox. Their dynasty built upon the union of love and politics, yet cursed by the impossibility of reconciling them. Among the courtiers, the boundaries between loyalty and temptation blurred easily. The young men who served the king were soldiers, poets, and pawns. The women who attended the queen were diplomats of charm, navigating peril with every gesture. One could lose a crown for a word spoken in passion, or gain the world through a single night's surrender. Every heartbeat carried the weight of betrayal. The air of the court was thick with incense and deceit. Priests preached virtue by day, while confessions by night revealed the sins of the powerful. Painters immortalized faces whose secrets they could never speak. The corridors of Hampton Court, still echoing today with the creak of old wood, once hid the hurried footsteps of lovers fleeing discovery. Each love story that unfolded there left a trace, invisible but enduring, shaping the legend of the Tudors as much as any war or decree. To live at court was to play a dangerous game. One wrong glance at the wrong time could summon accusation. One letter could condemn an entire family. Yet there were those who risked everything, some out of ambition, others out of genuine devotion. A rare, desperate longing that refused to obey kings. Their names would be buried in official histories, their words erased, but their choices would haunt generations. It was in this gilded labyrinth that the first whispers of forbidden love began to surface, between nobles and queens, between servants and royalty, between those whose hearts remembered that before God made kings, he made men and women. In an age that demanded obedience, to love freely was the truest form of rebellion. From the vantage of centuries, these stories appear almost mythic, too tragic, too tender to be real. Yet the documents that remain, the letters smudged with tears, the testimonies recorded by trembling hands, speak of a reality far more human than the portraits suggest. There was laughter in the gardens of Greenwich, secret vows spoken in candlelight, tears shed behind tapestries heavy with dust. And though the chroniclers wrote of law and lineage, the truth that endures is simpler. Even in the heart of absolute power, love refused to die quietly. What made these loves forbidden was not their existence, but their defiance. To love within the Tudor court was to challenge the invisible hierarchy, ordained by both heaven and crown. A king could command bodies, but not affections. A queen could be adored by nations, yet long for a touch she would never be allowed to claim. The tension between what was lawful and what was felt turned every gesture into theater, a performance where the penalty for honesty was death. The reign of Henry VIII would come to be defined by such contradictions. The young monarch who once wrote poetry of love would, in time, sign death warrants for the women who dared to return that love on their own terms. The court that celebrated romance in song would come to fear it in reality. Yet, through all its cruelty, something luminous persisted, a longing that neither decrees nor dungeons could erase. The tension between what was lawful and what was felt turned every gesture into theater, a performance where the penalty for honesty was death. The reign of Henry VIII would come to be defined by such contradictions. The young monarch who once wrote poetry of love would, in time, sign death warrants for the women who dared to return that love on their own terms. The court that celebrated romance in song would come to fear it in reality. Yet, through all its cruelty, something luminous persisted, a longing that neither decrees nor dungeons could erase. The candlelight of the Tudor court dimmed, and in its flicker, another story began. One written not in rebellion or lust, but in devotion, but dared to breathe within the iron confines of a throne. Among all the hearts that beat in secret under Henry VIII's reign, few shone as quietly and as defiantly as those of Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon. Their love did not threaten kingdoms or topple churches. It did something far more dangerous. It reminded a world of power that there was still such a thing as sincerity. Mary was the king's sister, the daughter of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, born from the union that had ended the Wars of the Roses. She was, in every sense, a Tudor. Her blood carried the reconciliation of England itself. Those who saw her as a child in the royal nursery described her as radiant, her laughter unguarded, her temper quick but kind. She inherited her mother's beauty, golden hair that glowed like fire beneath candlelight, and eyes that could disarm even the proudest courtier. Her brother Henry adored her, calling her his Pearl of England. But pearls, in the language of power, were never free. As Henry ascended the throne in 1509, barely 18 and already hungry to outshine his father's cautious legacy, the court transformed. Masques, feasts, and tournaments replaced the austerity of the old reign. Henry's youth demanded display, banners fluttering over Whitehall, lutes echoing in the galleries, the laughter of courtiers like ripples across still water. Mary moved through this new world as both participant and prize. Her presence at court was part of its brilliance, a living emblem of Tudor beauty, a reminder that the dynasty was young and glorious. But even then, the threads of her fate were being woven elsewhere, in the cold chambers of diplomacy, where her hand would soon become the cost of peace. Europe at the time was a chessboard of marriages. The alliances between England, Spain, France, and the Holy Roman Empire were as fragile as parchment, sealed with vows that could dissolve overnight. When Henry VIII sought to assert England's power among the continental monarchs, he found in his sister the perfect instrument. The aging King Louis XII of France, widowed and desperate for an heir, sought a young bride to secure his line. Henry saw opportunity. If his sister became Queen of France, he could bind the old rival kingdom to Tudor interests. Mary, 20 years old and in love with another, was told she would marry a man nearly 35 years her senior. Her heart, however, already belonged to Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, childhood companion of Henry, soldier of skill and reputation, a man whose loyalty had been tested in battle and council alike. Brandon was everything the Tudor court admired: tall, confident, gallant, with the easy grace of a knight who had seen blood but still believed in virtue. He had known Mary since her youth, and what began as admiration deepened over years of proximity into something neither dared to speak aloud. In a world where affection was currency, theirs was a bond beyond purchase. The chronicles speak of the moment Mary learned of her betrothal. It was at Greenwich, during a winter feast. The ambassadors had arrived with gifts of silver and silk, the terms already agreed upon. When Henry announced the match, Mary's face did not change. She curtsied, smiled, and said the words required of her. "Your Majesty's will is my own." But that night, in her private chapel, witnesses heard her pray for deliverance not from duty, but from the grief of obedience. In October 1514, she crossed the Channel with a retinue of English nobles. The French court received her with triumph. Banners of gold lilies fluttered above Paris, and the bells of Notre Dame rang for the new queen. Louis XII, frail and grey, waited at the altar. The wedding was an affair of state, not of the heart. The vows were spoken through translators, the kiss ceremonial. When Mary signed her name as Queen of France, she did so with a trembling hand. The poets called it alliance. The truth was exile. Her queenship lasted less than 3 months. Louis, already weakened by illness, died on the first day of 1515. Mary, barely 20, found herself a widow in a foreign land. By custom, she should have remained in mourning for 40 days, veiled and silent, while her brother arranged her next marriage to yet another prince. But love, long buried beneath diplomacy, now demanded its reckoning. Charles Brandon had been sent to France by Henry himself, ostensibly to negotiate her return, secretly to keep her from falling into French hands. When they met in the quiet chambers of Cluny, away from courtiers and ambassadors, their reunion broke the careful discipline of years. Letters from witnesses speak of it in fragments: the Queen's tears, the Duke's trembling voice, their hands entwined over the treaty papers. Mary confessed what she had once sworn never to say, that she would rather die than be given to another king. Brandon, torn between honor and longing, faced a choice no soldier could win. They married in secret. No ambassadors, no royal witnesses, no approval from the King of England. Just 2 souls beneath a vaulted ceiling, bound not by power, but by will. In that moment, they defied the order of the world. It was treason, technically, a direct act of disobedience to the crown. When the news reached Henry, his fury was legendary. He called for their arrest, for their titles to be stripped, for Brandon to face the executioner's axe. The court trembled, expecting the headsman to be summoned before the week was out. Yet something stayed his hand. Historians would later debate whether it was affection for his sister or admiration for the man he had once called friend Henry. For all his pride, understood the rarity of genuine loyalty. He summoned them home, their lives hanging on his word. When they entered the royal chamber at Greenwich, they knelt. Mary pale but unbroken, Brandon solemn, ready for death. Henry studied them for a long time, then laughed. "By God," he said, "you have both played the game well." He fined them a fortune, a symbolic punishment, and restored them to grace. In one stroke, he had turned scandal into legend. Mary became the Duchess of Suffolk. She and Brandon withdrew from the center of court, building a quieter life in the countryside, raising children far from intrigue. Their estates at Westhorpe became a refuge, a world of gardens and music, where the sound of laughter replaced the noise of politics. Visitors described them as a couple unlike any other of their age, affectionate in public, devoted in private. Brandon still served the crown, leading campaigns and councils, but always returned home to her. Their love, forged in defiance, endured in peace. It would not be entirely free of sorrow. The years of childbirth and illness wore on Mary. Her beauty faded, but not the gentleness that had once softened even Henry's rage. When she died in 1533, at just 37, Brandon ordered her buried not in Westminster among queens, but in Suffolk, near their home, among their people. At her funeral, he walked behind her coffin not as a duke, but as a husband. Those who saw him said that for the first time, the proud soldier wept openly. In the annals of Tudor history, their names are footnotes beside kings and queens. But among the hidden loves of the dynasty, theirs remains the rarest. A love that was not born of ambition or politics, but in defiance of them. They proved that even within the machinery of power, tenderness could survive, and that forgiveness, though costly, could be stronger than vengeance. The court would change after them. Henry's later years grew darker. Suspicion replaced laughter, and affection became a currency too dangerous to trade. But somewhere, perhaps in the quiet memory of his sister's courage, the king carried a reminder that love, once true, could tame even a crown. When visitors walk today through the ruins of Westhorpe Hall, they find little left, a few broken arches, a trace of garden paths beneath the weeds. But on spring mornings, when the air is still, the place holds a peculiar peace. It is said that if one stands beneath the old yew trees, the air smells faintly of roses, not the red of Lancaster or the white of York, but both entwined, like the emblem Mary once bore on her sleeve. Some say that Mary Tudor's defiance softened her brother's heart in the years to come. Others claim it was her memory that haunted him, when he later condemned the women he loved. There is no record of what Henry truly felt when he spoke of her in old age, only a remark to a courtier. "She did what none dared, and God forgive me, I loved her for it." The story of Mary and Charles stands as the first whisper of rebellion in a dynasty obsessed with control. It was proof that the Tudor heart, though bound by iron and doctrine, could still remember how to beat freely. And though the crown would demand obedience, the memory of that defiance would linger, a soft light within the darkness of the court, illuminating for a moment the possibility that love, however forbidden, could still redeem the human soul. The story of Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon faded, like a candle that had burned clean and bright, leaving only the faint perfume of wax in the air. But time in the Tudor court did not stand still. The years turned, and the warmth that had once softened Henry VIII's reign began to curdle into suspicion. The young king who had once forgiven love grew into a monarch who feared it. By the 1540s, the laughter of the early court had vanished. The banquets that once echoed with music now felt like rituals of surveillance. Every guest was a potential spy, every smile an act of calculation. The old fire of Henry's youth had turned to bitterness. His body, once athletic and admired, had grown heavy, his leg ulcerous and festering. Pain became his daily companion, and paranoia his closest counselor. Love to him was no longer a balm but a threat. It was in this world of decay that Catherine Howard appeared, the king's fifth wife, and the last to awaken in him the illusion of tenderness. She entered the stage like a melody remembered from youth, bright, light, and tragically brief. Catherine was young, no older than 19 when she became queen, and she came from a lesser branch of the powerful Howard family. Her childhood had been restless, almost forgotten by history. A girl raised in the chaotic household of her step-grandmother, where discipline was scarce and lessons were few. It was there that she learned the art of charm, of laughter that could soften authority. She was not educated like Anne Boleyn, or stately like Jane Seymour. She was sunlight, untrained but radiant. When she arrived at court as lady-in-waiting to Anne of Cleves, the German Princess Henry married and soon discarded, she caught the king's attention at once. He was nearly 50, she, barely out of girlhood. Yet when Henry looked upon her, he seemed to see not Catherine Howard, but the ghost of his own lost youth. Her laughter reminded him of the tournaments, the music, the easy joy of his early reign. For a moment, she made him believe time could turn backward. The court chroniclers describe the transformation vividly. The king, once slumped and silent, began to smile again. He gave her jewels, gowns of crimson and gold, and a motto to mark her place in his heart. "No other will but yours." It was the declaration of a man who mistook possession for passion. Catherine, overwhelmed by the force of his devotion, played her role as best she could. But within the shadows of that romance lay a secret, one that would end not only her life, but any trace of tenderness in Henry's soul. Long before the crown, Catherine had known another kind of affection. In her youth, she had been courted by Thomas Culpeper, a young gentleman of the king's household, handsome, daring, and reckless. He was everything her royal husband was not. Quick with words, alive with mischief, untamed. Their bond, formed long before her marriage, had been whispered about but never proven. When Catherine became queen, Culpeper was promoted to serve close to her chambers. The past, buried under silk and ceremony, returned like a ghost that refused to stay silent. The evidence of what passed between them survives only in fragments. A handful of letters, written in a careful hand but burning with emotion. One, preserved by the interrogators who later condemned her, reads, "I never longed for anything so much as I do to see you and to speak with you. It makes my heart die to think what fortune we must bear." It is the kind of confession that should have been whispered in private. Instead, it became the instrument of her ruin. The meetings between Catherine and Culpeper took place in the hidden passages of Hampton Court Palace. The rooms there still stand. Narrow, candlelit corridors winding like veins through the stone. The servants who arranged the meetings thought they were helping love. In truth, they were weaving a noose. In those nights, the queen who wore rubies by day became a trembling girl again, daring to remember what it felt like to be wanted rather than worshipped. But the walls of Hampton Court have ears. One of her former companions, jealous and fearful, confided her suspicions to the Archbishop of Canterbury. From that moment, the machinery of accusation began to turn. Interrogations followed. Rooms were searched. The Queen's household was divided under questioning. The court, long practiced in survival, turned silent. Henry, still basking in the illusion of happiness, was the last to know. When the truth reached him, it shattered whatever humanity remained. He refused to believe it at first, not out of mercy, but pride. He had chosen her, adorned her, made her his wife and queen. To accept her betrayal was to face his own weakness. Yet the evidence grew undeniable. Letters, testimonies, servants' confessions. Each word was another stone sealing her fate. It is said that when Henry finally read her confession, he tore it apart and collapsed into silence. For hours, no one dared approach him. Then, without warning, he ordered that Catherine be confined. The palace became a prison. The music stopped. Catherine was taken from Hampton Court to the Tower of London. The journey was short, but for her it must have felt eternal. A ride from gilded splendor to the cold echo of doom. The Queen's apartments were stripped, her portraits removed. The courtiers who once bowed before her now avoided her name. Only the ravens on the tower's battlements bore witness to her grief. What she thought in those final days can only be imagined. The records tell us she asked for forgiveness, not from the king, but from God. Yet witnesses also spoke of a calm that seemed unnatural. Perhaps she knew that in a court ruled by fear, innocence and guilt were often the same. Thomas Culpeper was executed first. On a bitter winter morning, he faced the crowd and prayed aloud before the axe fell. His last words, recorded by a clerk, were brief. "God, have mercy on me." His head was displayed on London Bridge as a warning to others. Catherine's execution followed days later, on February 13, 1542. She was led from her cell dressed in black velvet, her hair uncovered, her face pale but composed. Those who saw her said she looked like a child walking to her own funeral. She asked for the block to be brought closer. Then, kneeling, she spoke softly. "I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpeper." The blade fell, and with it, the last illusion of Henry's mercy. Her death marked a turning point in the Tudor story. After Catherine, love itself became suspect. The king's court turned from brilliance to dread. Where once he had sought companionship, he now demanded silence. The laughter that had filled the galleries under Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon was replaced by the rustle of parchment and the hiss of gossip. The story of Catherine Howard and Thomas Culpeper became a cautionary tale, not merely of adultery, but of the fatal cost of affection in a world where the monarch's desire was law. To love another while belonging to the king was not only treason, it was heresy against the divine order that placed him above all others. Yet even as history condemned her, a quiet sympathy survived. Some chroniclers would later argue that she had been a fool, a child unfit for the crown. Others suggested something deeper, that she was a victim of her own humanity, placed in a role no heart could endure. The evidence of her letters, tender and desperate, supports neither guilt nor innocence, only longing. In them, one hears not a schemer, but a soul suffocating under ceremony. Henry would live another 5 years after her death, but the part of him capable of affection died with her. The man who once wrote songs of courtly love now signed decrees in silence, his hand swollen and trembling. Those who attended him in his last years spoke of strange moments when his anger faded and he would gaze into the fire, murmuring to himself words no one could hear. Some said he spoke her name. The ghosts of Catherine and Culpeper linger still in the walls of Hampton Court. Guides speak of footsteps echoing through the long gallery at night, the sound of running and the faint cry of a woman. It is said that on the anniversary of her death, the air grows cold and candles gutter for no reason. superstition, perhaps, or the remnants of a story too human to be forgotten. In the broader chronicle of the Tudors, their affair was a scandal, a caution, a footnote. Yet beneath the dust of judgment lies a truth older than crowns, that love, denied its rightful place, will find expression even in ruin. Catherine Howard's tragedy was not merely that she loved unwisely, but that she lived in a world where wisdom demanded the death of warmth itself. To the chroniclers of the age, she was the rose that bloomed too soon. To the centuries that followed, she remains a question, a symbol of what happens when innocence collides with power. The queen who died for love, and the man who loved her into oblivion. Her story closes the door that Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon had opened, the door through which love might have redeemed monarchy. In its place came fear, the cold governance of duty, and the long shadow that would haunt the Tudor line until its final heir. Yet even as the palace turned to stone, one truth endured, echoing through history like a prayer, that no crown, no decree, no executioner's blade can silence the forbidden heart. The scaffold at the tower was taken down, the axe cleaned, the black cloth folded away. Yet even after the blood had dried, the shadow of Catherine Howard's death did not leave England. Henry VIII lived on, heavy and haunted, a king who had executed not only wives, but the very possibility of tenderness. He died in 1547, and with him ended the age of the monstrous patriarch, but not the echo of his reign. His legacy was a country drenched in both glory and grief, and a generation raised in the cold aftermath of power without mercy. From that broken inheritance would rise a queen unlike any the world had known. Elizabeth Tudor, daughter of Henry and Anne Boleyn, the orphan child of ambition and blood. Her mother had been executed when Elizabeth was barely 3. Her father's memory was a ghost of both majesty and terror. She grew up not in palaces of love, but in corridors of caution, learning early that affection could destroy, and that silence was often safer than truth. Yet even as she absorbed the lessons of her lineage, something in her refused to die. A fierce, quiet hunger for freedom. By the time she came to the throne in 1558, England was weary. The rule of her half-sister, Mary I, had drenched the realm in the smoke of burning heretics and the stench of Spanish authority. When Elizabeth rode through London on the day of her coronation, the people looked upon her not as a queen born to rule, but as a miracle returned from exile. The daughter of Anne Boleyn, the child once called bastard, now wore the crown her mother had died for. She was 25, tall, composed, eyes bright as amber. Yet behind the carefully painted face lay a heart trained in restraint. Elizabeth had inherited her father's will, her mother's intelligence, and the hard-earned instinct of survival. The court expected her to marry quickly, to secure the dynasty, but she, remembering the fate of every Tudor woman who had bound herself to love, made another vow, that she would never be ruled by it. And yet, even the Virgin Queen was not beyond the reach of the forbidden heart. He had been there from the beginning, Robert Dudley, the boy she had known since youth. They had been imprisoned in the same tower during her sister's reign, both accused of treason. When she emerged to freedom, he was at her side. When she ascended the throne, he stood behind her horse, his gaze steady amid the sea of nobles. He was tall, dark-haired, elegant, and fiercely loyal, the kind of man whose presence drew the eye, even when he said nothing. Elizabeth trusted him as she trusted few others. In the early years of her reign, she made him master of the horse, a position that kept him always near her. Too near, some whispered. The foreign ambassadors, skilled in the art of rumor, began to write of what they saw. The Queen and her favorite, walking together in the gardens of Whitehall at dusk, laughing softly, her hand brushing his arm as she leaned in to speak. The long hours they spent in private council, the glances exchanged across banquets. "It is said," one Spanish envoy wrote, "that Her Majesty dines on nothing but Dudley's eyes." At first, Elizabeth laughed off the gossip, but England, like its queen, was a jealous mistress. Every friendship, every gesture became political. The lords of her council, men like Cecil and Norfolk, warned her that affection was dangerous. A queen's heart was not her own. It belonged to the realm. But Elizabeth, who had spent her childhood under the watch of tyrants, believed she could govern her own soul. Dudley was married, unhappily, to a woman named Amy Robsart, a gentle country lady who lived far from court. Her existence was an inconvenience to Elizabeth's enemies, who used it as proof that the Queen's affection was unchaste. When Amy was found dead at the foot of a staircase in 1560, her neck broken, her death ruled an accident, England erupted in whispers. Some said she had fallen. Others said she had been pushed. No one dared to name the hand that might have guided her fall. For Elizabeth, the scandal was devastating. The love that had once been her private comfort now stood before the world as accusation. She withdrew from public appearances, her grief expressed not in tears, but in silence. When she finally returned to court, she had changed. The warmth that had once marked her early reign was gone, replaced by a polished, deliberate composure. The crown, once a burden shared with affection, became a shield. Still, Dudley remained. She could not let him go, and perhaps did not wish to. He became the constant in her life, the companion of her triumphs, the shadow of her solitude. They wrote to each other in guarded phrases, balancing tenderness with formality. She called him "my eyes," "my sweet Robin." In moments of crisis, rebellion, plague, war, his letters were the only ones that reached her chamber unchallenged. He, in turn, loved her with the loyalty of a man who understood both her power and her loneliness. Yet he too was trapped, a servant to a queen who could never be his. The courtiers mocked him behind his back, calling him the king who will never reign. Foreign princes, seeking Elizabeth's hand, came and went, but none could match the bond between her and the man she could neither wed nor dismiss. As the years passed, their relationship became a riddle even to those who knew them best. They quarreled, reconciled, and quarreled again. Two proud spirits caught between affection and duty. Elizabeth's refusal to marry became a policy of survival. To choose one man was to divide a nation, so she chose no one, yet loved one too deeply to forget. When rebellion rose in the north, Dudley commanded her forces. When plague struck London, he stayed by her side, while others fled. Yet even his devotion could not overcome the barrier between them. She was not merely a woman. She was England itself. And England, as she once said, has one mistress and no master. In 1588, when the Spanish Armada threatened the realm, Dudley rode with her to Tilbury, where the Queen delivered her immortal speech. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." The crowd roared. The nation rallied. But those who stood close enough to see her eyes knew that her words were not just for her soldiers. They were for him. It was his faith in her, that had become the quiet foundation of her strength. Soon after that victory, he fell ill. The weight of years, the exhaustion of service, and the sorrow of a love unfulfilled brought him low. He wrote to her one last time, a simple note. "I am very sick. Your Majesty, I most humbly kiss your hand." She never saw him again. When word came of his death, she locked herself in her chamber for days, refusing food or company. When at last her servants broke down the door, they found her sitting by the window, the letter open on her lap, its edges worn by her touch. She wrote on the outside, in her own hand, "His last letter, yet it shall be with me forever." That scrap of paper would remain with her until she died. In the years that followed, Elizabeth's legend grew. The Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the embodiment of an age. Artists painted her as an icon, face pale and eternal, eyes detached from human sorrow. But behind that mask, those who served her longest saw a woman haunted by the one thing she could not command: time. The more she ruled, the lonelier she became. As her youth faded, she filled her palaces with mirrors and music. She wore gowns embroidered with suns and moons, as though to remind herself she was beyond decay. Yet the courtiers who once flattered her beauty now whispered of her vanity. She danced less often, laughed more softly. The court, ever hungry for novelty, shifted its affection to younger favorites. But none ever replaced the man whose absence was a wound she would never show. When she walked in the gardens of Richmond or Greenwich, she sometimes paused at sunset, watching the light turn gold over the Thames. It was said that in those moments her face softened, not the face of a monarch, but of a woman remembering a life unlived. She had given England everything: stability, greatness, identity. But the price was isolation. In sacrificing her heart for her realm, she had fulfilled the Tudor destiny: to rule, to endure, and to be alone. And yet, in that solitude, she achieved something her forebears never could. Where Henry VIII had destroyed through desire, Elizabeth preserved through denial. She transformed love itself into power, a love not for one man, but for a nation. Her reign became a paradox of passion without possession, affection without surrender. When she died in 1603, after 45 years on the throne, her body was carried to Westminster Abbey. There she was laid to rest, not beside a husband, she had none, but above her half-sister Mary. The inscription carved into the stone beneath her effigy reads, "Partners in throne and grave, here we sleep." But beside her heart, buried with her body, was that worn letter, folded and sealed, the last words of Robert Dudley. Thus ended the longest and strangest love story of the Tudor age. A union without marriage, a passion that survived without consummation, a devotion that outlasted both life and rumor. In an era that punished women for feeling, Elizabeth dared to feel and to rule. She did not allow love to destroy her. She made it immortal. If one walks through the long gallery of Hatfield House today, where she once played the virginals and read letters by candlelight, one may sense her presence still. The faint rustle of silk, the scent of orris powder, the echo of a voice that could command armies and whisper affection in the same breath. She is neither saint nor martyr, neither virgin nor lover, but something more enduring, the embodiment of what it means to hold power and still long to be known. The forbidden heart of the Tudors had not vanished with her. It simply changed shape, from the whispered vows of Mary Tudor to the doomed passion of Catherine Howard, to the silent endurance of Elizabeth herself. Each had loved in defiance of the same truth, that in the house of Tudor, to love deeply was to stand at the edge of destruction. And yet, through their defiance, they made that dynasty more human. Their stories remain not just as relics of tragedy, but as proof that even within the cold architecture of monarchy, the heart could still dare to beat. The reign of Elizabeth I closed the circle that her father's blood had opened. When she died, the Tudor sun sank in solemn splendor, leaving behind not heirs, but echoes, faint, trembling, human. Yet before her legend hardened into marble, another story, older and darker, had already shaped the myth of love and loss that haunted her entire dynasty. It was a story born before Elizabeth's triumph, before her virgin crown. The tale of two sisters, whose beauty and ambition lit the fire that forged the Tudor age, and whose downfall warned every woman who came after what it meant to love a king. The Boleyn sisters, Anne and Mary, were ghosts in Elizabeth's blood. Their lives, divided by choice and chance, embodied the very heart of Tudor contradiction. Love and destruction entwined like the petals of a rose. To speak of them is to peel back the last veil of the dynasty, to look upon the wound that would define its soul. The world into which they were born was not yet the polished court of Elizabeth's England, but a harsher, hungrier place, the reign of Henry VIII in his prime. The young king, newly enthroned, was the golden promise of his generation. Handsome, strong, and reckless, a ruler who believed God himself had chosen him for glory. In those early years, his court shimmered with pageantry. Jousts thundered across the tilt-yard, banquets overflowed with wine and laughter. Beneath the surface, however, the old order of England, the medieval order of church and pope, was beginning to crack. Into that glittering and dangerous world stepped the Boleyn sisters. Their father, Sir Thomas Boleyn, was a diplomat and courtier of cunning ambition, a man who saw opportunity in proximity. Their mother, Lady Elizabeth Howard, came from noble blood, proud, sharp, and conscious of rank. The sisters were raised not merely to be wives, but to be instruments of their family's ascent. Mary was the elder, soft-spoken, golden-haired, with a beauty that seemed effortless. Anne, younger by a few years, was darker in both complexion and temperament. Where Mary charmed, Anne fascinated. She had spent time in the French court, absorbing its elegance and its intrigue, learning the art of conversation and the delicate warfare of flirtation. She returned to England not as a naive girl, but as a weapon of wit wrapped in silk. Mary came first into the king's orbit. It was around 1520, when Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, his queen of nearly a decade, had begun to fade into sterility and silence. Mary was already wed to another man, William Carey, but in the Tudor court that mattered little when the king's desire stirred. For a time she was his mistress. The evidence is scattered, brief notes, rumors in letters, a few grants of land and favor. Some even whispered that one or both of her children were Henry's, though history would never confirm it. Her affair with the king was not scandalous in itself. Such things were the unspoken currency of royal favor. What was unusual was how quickly it ended. Mary was too gentle for politics, too honest for the game. When the king's attention shifted, she did not scheme to regain it. Instead, she withdrew into the quiet dignity of her household, her beauty dimmed, but not broken. Anne watched and learned. When she first appeared at court, she did so not as a seductress, but as a curiosity. She sang, she danced, she spoke with wit and a grace that set her apart from the simpering courtiers. Henry noticed her during a masque. Her eyes, sharp as flint, met his and did not lower. It was not love at first sight. It was fascination. He pursued, expecting surrender. She refused, expecting something more. Her refusal changed England. In a court where every woman bowed to a king's pleasure, Anne demanded a crown. She told Henry she would not be his mistress as her sister had been. If he wanted her, he must make her queen. To the world, it was audacity. To Henry, it was an irresistible challenge. What began as flirtation became obsession. He wrote her letters in his own hand, rare, desperate, almost childish in their longing. "I have been struck by the dart of love," he confessed, "and I cannot find comfort but in your favor." For 7 years he pursued her, fighting the church itself to make her his wife. Catherine of Aragon refused to yield her marriage. Rome refused to grant an annulment. So Henry broke from Rome, declaring himself head of a new Church of England. Nations trembled. Monasteries burned. And at the center of that storm stood Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom an empire had been severed from its faith. When at last she became queen in 1533, her triumph was absolute and fleeting. She was crowned in a ceremony meant to rival any of Christendom's glories. The streets were hung with banners of red and gold. Trumpets sounded from the towers. Yet as she knelt to receive the crown of St. Edward, the crowd's cheers were faint. Many saw her not as deliverance, but as blasphemy. For a time, Henry's passion sustained her. Their child, born later that year, was a girl, Elizabeth, not the male heir he had promised himself. Anne wept, but Henry forgave her. He swore they would have sons. Yet with every passing month, the old fire dimmed. Her quick temper, once intoxicating, now stung his pride. Her wit, once magnetic, became insolence. The courtiers who had fawned over her now whispered of her arrogance, her witchcraft, her hold over the king's mind. When her second and third pregnancies ended in miscarriage, the whispers turned to accusations. Henry, growing restless, began to notice another, Jane Seymour, quiet, pale, submissive. The pattern repeated, desire breeding defiance, defiance breeding ruin. Anne's fall was swift and merciless. In May 1536, she was arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and treason. Accusations so grotesque that even her enemies struggled to believe them. Her brother, George Boleyn, was accused with her. The evidence was fabricated, the verdict predetermined. The same courtiers who once bowed to her now presided over her destruction. In the Tower, where she had once watched the coronation of others, she awaited her own death. Her last letter to Henry, if indeed it was hers, spoke not of vengeance but bewilderment. Your Grace's displeasure and my imprisonment are things so strange to me, as what to write or what to excuse, I am altogether ignorant. She had gambled with destiny and lost. On the morning of her execution, the scaffold was built within the Tower grounds. She had been granted the mercy of a French swordsman, swift and clean. When she stepped into the courtyard, the witnesses fell silent. Dressed in grey damask and crimson, she looked more bride than prisoner. She knelt, her face serene, and said only, "I pray God save the king." The sword flashed, and with it ended not only a life but the illusion that love could survive within the machinery of power. Yet even as her body was buried in the chapel beneath the tower stones, her legacy stirred. The daughter she left behind would rise to avenge her, not with blood, but with endurance. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, would transform her mother's shame into sovereignty. In the calm of her gaze, in the firmness of her will, lived the echo of Anne Boleyn's defiance. And what of Mary, the forgotten sister? After Anne's death, she vanished from court entirely. Her husband dead, her fortune gone, she married again, this time for love, to a common soldier named William Stafford. It was a scandal beyond forgiveness. Henry, furious, banished her. But Mary did not beg to return. She lived quietly in the countryside, raising her children, far from the poison of palaces. When she died in 1543, at 38, she asked for no grand tomb, no heraldic crest, only a simple burial. There are no surviving portraits of her older years, no letters to reveal her thoughts. Yet in that silence lies something powerful. She escaped. Where her sister had risen and fallen in fire, Mary faded into peace. In her modest home, tending her garden, she perhaps watched her sister's child, the young Elizabeth, grow into womanhood and thought, with a measure of sorrow and pride, "She has our mother's eyes." The two sisters, divided in life, became joined in memory. One represented ambition, the other compassion. One burned bright and perished, the other dimmed softly and survived. Together, they became the eternal parable of Tudor womanhood, the price of being seen and the price of being forgotten. Centuries later, their graves remain as contrasts. Anne beneath the cold stones of the tower, unmarked for years. Mary in a quiet parish far from London. But both, in their own way, shaped the course of England. Without Anne's defiance, there would be no Elizabeth. Without Mary's quiet endurance, there would be no proof that a woman could live beyond the reach of kings. Theirs was the final chapter in the great tapestry of Tudor love, the last lesson written in blood and silence. Each woman of that line had loved and suffered in her own fashion. Mary Tudor for freedom, Catherine Howard for passion, Elizabeth for duty, Anne and Mary Boleyn for fate. Each carried within her the same impossible truth, that love in the house of Tudor was both crown and curse. When one walks through the tower today, past the chapel where Anne was laid to rest, the air is heavy with her memory. The stones seem to hold their breath, and somewhere, beyond the reach of history's noise, one might almost hear the murmur of two voices, one proud, one gentle, intertwined across centuries. It is said that love built the Tudor dynasty, and love destroyed it. Yet the truth perhaps is simpler. Love humanized it. For all the power, the blood, the thrones, the Tudor story remains not a chronicle of conquest, but of hearts that dared to feel beneath the weight of crowns. And so, the scroll closes, not with triumph or despair, but with understanding. In the end, the Tudors did not master love. They revealed it, in all its fragile, perilous splendor. They taught that to love in a world of power is to risk everything, and that even in ruin, such love leaves a trace that time itself cannot erase. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.